Conflicts That Shaped Pharaonic Egypt, Lecture 10, Diplomacy and Buffer States in the Near East.
Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten were not only religious innovators or meddlers, depending on how you see it, they were also diplomatists about whose activities we know more than we know for most other pharaohs, thanks to a chance discovery at the site of Akhenaten. In 1887, while digging Sebach, the fertile remains of ancient mud brick architecture and living debris, a peasant woman from a village near Amarna discovered a cache of clay tablets that record correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, possibly Akhenaten's ephemeral successors, and Tutankhamun, with rulers of the major kingdoms of the ancient Near East and Egyptian vassal states in southern Syria, Palestine. These documents that we commonly call the Amarna letters are a portion of the archive, probably only a small portion of the archive, once housed in the Office of the Letters of Pharaoh, a building in the central part of the city of Akhenaten. The clay tablets are covered in cuneiform, the tiny wedge-shaped writing of ancient Mesopotamia. The language of the texts is almost entirely in a Northwest Semitic-influenced Akkadian. In rare cases, other languages such as Hittite or Hurrian appear within the archive. A few of the tablets retain traces of ink notations added to them in Egyptian hieratic, the cursive Egyptian script. Little notations almost certainly added for filing purposes within the Office of the Letters. Now, from the time of the alliance between Mitanni and Egypt, that we find well in place during the reign of Thutmose IV, there is a relatively peaceful balance of power in the ancient Near East. This will change with the expansionist policies of Shupoluluma I, king of the Indo-European language-speaking Hittites based in central Anatolia. The policies of Shupoluluma I will force the great powers of the ancient Near East to rethink their foreign policies. The one who will ultimately pay the greatest price in the Hittite rise to international prominence is Mitanni, and certainly all Egyptian rulers of the next 100 years will have to trouble themselves with the problem of what the Egyptians call the wretched land of Khati. The Egyptians often add the epithet Hesi, or wretched, after the name of a foreign country, apparently as sort of a magical way of keeping them down in their proper place. Although Akhenaten is usually accused of negligence, to say the least, in his foreign policy, sometimes even a pacifist disinterest in foreign policy, an examination of this international correspondence suggests that, in fact, he may have mastered a Machiavellian approach about 3,000 years before Machiavelli actually codified that approach. The story of this series of events begins during the reign of Amenhotep III, and much of this activity that we see recorded in the Amarna letters actually centers on the land of Amurru. Amurru, roughly in modern southern Lebanon, is located between the southern Levantine ports that were clearly under Egyptian hegemony and Ugarit and the southern fringe of Hittite lands to the north. Amurru was predestined to enjoy or suffer the attentions of both Egypt and the land of the Hittites. Already during the reign of Amenhotep III, Mitanni begins to decline as a major power. Mitanni has almost entirely ceased to be a major power by the death of Akhenaten. This decline of Mitanni leaves Egypt without any ally in the Near East against the growing power of the Hittites. Now, Thutmose I decided that Egyptian foreign policy in the northeast should be a very far forward front in the area. Extend the Egyptian sphere of influence as far away as possible. During the reign of Amenhotep III and during the reign of Akhenaten, we see a corollary develop to this. Not only should Egypt be interested in lands as far away as possible in the northeast, but she should also seek out a buffer state, a land that by itself would not be a threat to her, but that with Egyptian support, together with Egyptian power, could oppose successfully any third, potentially inimical power in the region. If a secondary power might come to the fore that could replace Mitanni and form an even better buffer between Egypt and the Hittite lands to the north, such a state might well center in the territory of Amurru. Amurru is further west than Mitanni. Amurru might engage in shipping and trade in the East Mediterranean, and Amurru would be directly physically located between areas of Egyptian influence and areas of Hittite influence. Peculiarities of Amurru's human populations that might have stunted her earlier development all of a sudden become an asset in the rise of Amurru during the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. There were no major urban settlements in the region of Amurru, but it was instead the center of a group who appear in the Amarna letters as the Apiru. These are a people who inhabit the region of the Bekaa Valley, and because of the geography and climate of that region, they appear to alternate between nomadism and agriculture. These people appear in the Amarna letters as often ferocious bands of brigands, existing around the fringes of settled society, who understand the ways both of nomadic groups and of settled groups, who alternately participate in those two lifestyles, and who prey on their sedentary neighbors. These people, the Apiru, some of them tradespeople, sometimes engaged in a sedentary lifestyle, sometimes in a mobile lifestyle, and apparently somewhat ruthless and highly militarized, these Apiru become an important weapon in the military and diplomatic arsenal of the state of Amurru that we will call the Amorites. At the time of the collapse of Mitanni, Egypt and the Hittites might well have found themselves without any sort of a buffer state. They might simply have been looking at each other across some not so demilitarized zone. Fortunately for both the Hittites and Egyptians, a crafty, duplicitous, and incredibly egotistical politician arose in Amurru, a man who could communicate diplomatically like no one else and could maneuver in ways comprehensible to the large states to his south and north, and who at the same time could have a symbiotic relationship with these wild Apiru. This man was named Abdiashirta. The Apiru become his collective cat's paw in a fight to enlarge and strengthen the new state of Amurru. They are the bringers of chaos and change whose onslaughts, urged on by Abdiashirta, require the arrival of Abdiashirta to restore order. Abdiashirta instituted this cycle of destabilization and then incorporation of the destabilized areas into Amurru, quote, for their own good, in order to expand his territory and to create for the first time a unified power in this area of Amurru. Now let's look at details of one of Abdiashirta's strikes against the Egyptian-controlled city of Sumur on the coast. This will show the genius of his strategy and the very real inherent dangers of his actions. Under Amenhotep III, the Egyptian commissioner of Sumur was a man called Pahanate, probably a cuneiform rendering of the Egyptian title Pahemnecher, the priest. Pahanate's area came under pressure from the Apiru. This is the first step of Abdiashirta's cycle of terror and restoration. The Amorite ruler unleashes the Apiru to disrupt commerce in a particular region and threaten the urban inhabitants. When the commissioner Pahanate left Sumur to visit Egypt, the Apiru move in, with Abdiashirta hard on their heels. This is the second step. When the Amorite ruler would advance into the threatened area, threatened by the Apiru whom he himself had egged on, Abdiashirta would then save the city from the threat of the Apiru. While Abdiashirta's designs on the city of Sumur appear to have achieved some military success, the Amorite king next had to extricate himself from the diplomatic consequences of invading one of Egypt's chief administrative centers in Syria-Palestine. Abdiashirta was constantly playing an elaborate game, juggling the Hittites to the north and the Egyptians to the south. Curiously enough, both Amenhotep III and Akhenaten seem to let this go on without coming even to the rescue not only of allies, but even some of their own people. This has led many to assume that Amenhotep III was negligent, and that Akhenaten was perhaps willfully negligent, worshipping the sun disk in his flower child-like way, eschewing war, and not wanting to get involved. Well, we know that the Aten extended his choice of weapons to Akhenaten in at least one scene. Akhenaten was not a pacifist. We must then ask, was Amenhotep III convinced of Abdiashirta's protestations that the Amorites occupied Sumur for the Egyptians? He appears actually to have presented himself, Abdiashirta, as having been made custodian of the region by the departing Egyptian commissioner. Does Amenhotep III believe this? If not, why did Egypt allow Abdiashirta to remain in power? Amenhotep III disregards the concerns of the ruler of Byblos, a man named Ribadi, who wrote letter after letter after letter after letter to Amenhotep III and to Akhenaten, complaining about the Amorites, begging for all sorts of help. Woe is me, until apparently Akhenaten is completely tired of hearing anything that Ribadi has to say. Why do Amenhotep III and Akhenaten appear to indulge Abdiashirta's aggression? Is their indulgence, in fact, a calculated decision based on another troubling situation? Mitanni may, in the very end, have decided to turn on Egypt. Just about the time that Abdiashirta gained control over Sumur, claiming to do this on behalf of the Egyptians, of course, Ribadi, the ruler of Byblos, reported that Shupalululiuma, the king of the Hittites, has seized all the countries that were vassals of the king of Mitanni. Abdiashirta, at the same time, the Amorite, says that local rulers loyal to Mitanni are annexing areas under Egyptian control. Is Mitanni in its death throes trying to seek new territory in the Egyptian sphere of influence? The combination of a Hittite menace to the north and the possible duplicity of Mitanni to the northeast may in fact have increased Amuru's importance in the eyes of Egypt's rulers. Abdiashirta's success at creating an effective buffer on the Egyptian empire's northern border might very well have made him worth the sacrifice of a few cities and some land under nominal Egyptian suzerainty. The Amorites soon absorbed the hinterland of Byblos itself. Ribadi at this time, hard pressed by the Apiru, Abdiashirta hard on their heels, wrote to Pharaoh saying, "Like a bird in a trap, that is how I am in Byblos." At the 12th hour, however, the bird turned out not to be Ribadi, but Abdiashirta himself. Ribadi had been in a trap indeed, but probably the bait in a trap of Pharaoh's setting. Apparently, at the very last minute, Abdiashirta outlived his original purpose to consolidate a backward area and provide a very self-serving buffer state between any possible Mitanni and Hittite interests and Egypt's sphere of influence. Egypt would have had every reason to want to remove Abdiashirta from power only at the moment when Amurru had advanced far enough that he could capture the last major Levantine port in Egypt's northern dependencies. At the very last minute, moving in on Byblos, Abdiashirta is captured and sent to Egypt. His final fate is uncertain, but he appears to have died in some fashion not long after a probable audience with the king of Egypt. At this point, Egypt and Amurru are in more or less the same situation in which they found themselves at the start of Abdiashirta's rise to power. Egypt, if it did nothing, would see the sons of Abdiashirta possibly struggle amongst themselves, and then we would see a repetition of Abdiashirta's cycle of disruption of cities, sending in the Apiru, moving in to restore order. Amurru might grow and consolidate within her sphere the disparate smaller entities that might perhaps, without the Amorites being there to intervene, fall into the control of larger, more menacing polities. In other words, Egypt, by doing basically nothing, would see the growth of an Amorite state rather far to the north that could swallow up places, keeping them from falling into the hands of the dying Mitanni or the rising Hittites, without Egypt herself having to go that extra long distance to control them, without Egypt having to expend the time, the funds, the manpower to control those areas. In fact, the cycle that we saw under Abdiashirta repeats itself. So either Egypt did not learn its lesson, or what happened under Abdiashirta was exactly what Egypt wanted, and Egypt may in fact have arranged to repeat the cycle. The Amorites protected local populations of the area both from themselves and from non-Egyptian intervention, and meant that Egypt didn't have to intervene. Probably not long after Abdiashirta's death, Amenhotep III died, and Amenhotep IV ascended the throne. Now, for the first decade of his rule as Amenhotep IV / Akhenaten, events in Syria-Palestine go more or less in the same way as they did in the latter part of the reign of Amenhotep III. Vassals accuse each other of aggressive behavior. Mitanni continues to lose territory to the Hittites. Amurru recovers from the loss of Abdiashirta and starts its process of destabilization and coming in to restore order and growing the Amorite state. A few years after his accession, Akhenaten sees the rise of another powerful Amorite whom he will use apparently exactly as Amenhotep III appears to have used Abdiashirta. The leader of the sons of Abdiashirta was a man named Aziru, who was able, like his father, to claim both to be loyal to Egypt in all he did, at least in the beginning, and at the same time enlarge his Amorite realm. Egypt very clearly did not want to absorb the Amorite state into her dependencies. Aziru appears on several occasions actually to have told local Egyptian officials he wanted to become a formal vassal of the pharaoh. And apparently each time, those officials rebuffed Aziru. The Egyptians wanted a destabilizing, growing, but ultimately not superpower-sized state in the realm of Amurru. Ultimately, Akhenaten allows the final, complete loss of the Egyptian control port of Sumur to the Amorites. A focus of sea lanes in the East Mediterranean was the area of Tripoli and Beirut. A crossing between the area of Beirut and the coast of Cyprus to the west would allow vessels traveling both to the east and to the west avoid the hated winds and narrows along the southern coast of Anatolia. Due to the currents and coastal winds in the East Mediterranean, an Egyptian fleet could attack north up the Levantine coast much more easily than any northern fleet could attack south along the same coast. If a force based in Egypt controlled even a few Levantine ports, it could water itself routinely, patrol the sea area, and supply land armies that might thereby roam at will through a hostile interior. This means that ports north of Beirut, essentially, were things that Egypt could take or leave, essentially. We see a parallel situation with medieval Egypt, when the Fatimid Egyptian fleet was able to assist Muslim land armies, and when coordinated activities between Muslim-controlled seaports and Muslim land armies could occur during the early years of the Crusader states, Egypt retained some power in the area. Medieval Egypt did not lose her ability to influence events in Palestine until the loss of most of the ports and the destruction of a fleet off Ashkelon and the loss of the last northern base at Tyre during the 1120s of our era. As long as certain key ports remained in Egyptian hands, both Amenhotep III and Akhenaten could be rather complacent about events inland. Lying as it did north of Beirut, Sumer was actually more important to the Amorites than to Egypt. As long as Egypt controlled some of the ports north to Beirut, Nilotic power in the eastern Mediterranean need not be particularly worried about the rise of the Amorites. Around 1340 BCE, the Hittite ruler Shupoluleyuma launched a final attack on Mitanni, captured almost all of the Mitannian vassals in northern Syria-Palestine, and captured the Mitanni capital of Washukani itself. The parts of Mitanni that the Hittites didn't seem to feel like controlling themselves, they left as an independent Hurrian rump state called Khani Galbat, probably a buffer of their own against the growing power of the Assyrians to the east. Now, as the Hittite army travels south to conquer one of the southern vassals of Mitanni, near the Egyptian-controlled region of Upa, they were attacked by the ruler of the city of Kadesh on the Orontes, essentially just to the southeast edge of the realm of Amurru. Apparently, the ruler of Kadesh was afraid of being outflanked by the Hittites. He claimed allegiance to the cause of Egypt, possibly to that of Mitanni as well. This ruler of Kadesh, Shutatara, was of course crushed by Shupoluleyuma and the Hittites, and he and his son Aitakama were taken hostage. The importance of this event is that the city of Kadesh, at the very far southeastern edge of the Amorite realm, located between the Amorites, the Egyptian sphere of influence, and a no man's land in the desert to the east of the Amorites, Kadesh will become the focus of struggle between the remaining superpowers at the end of the Amarna period, Egypt and the Hittites. A few years after the Great Syrian Campaign, Aziru, like Abdiashirta, is summoned to visit Egypt. In the absence of Aziru, two other sons of Abdiashirta assume the rulership of Amurru. Even without having to kill Aziru, Akhenaten does exactly what Amenhotep III does and arranges for yet another phase of instability in Amurru. Just as the Amorites used the Apiru to play with their neighbors, so the Egyptian rulers managed to play with the Amorites by summoning their rulers at an appropriate time to Egypt, introducing a little bit of paranoia and instability into those controlling the Amorite realm. Eventually, however, with the threat of renewed Hittite aggression, Akhenaten lets Aziru go home. And of course, when Aziru gets home, he starts doing exactly what you would expect one of these Amorite rulers to do. He starts opening negotiations with the Hittites. Now, did Akhenaten really believe Aziru was loyal to him? Did the Hittites actually believe that Aziru would become loyal to them? Or did the Egyptians and possibly even the Hittites realize that no matter how large Amurru became, it probably wouldn't become big enough itself to be a threat either to Egypt or to the Hittites, but that if they let it grow, it would become a relatively stable buffer state that would not be that interested either in being taken over by the Egyptians or by the Hittites. Certainly, if Aziru had gone back to Amurru wearing a big cartouche of Akhenaten on his chest, proclaiming himself the true blue servant of Pharaoh, he would have lost a lot of his value as the leader of a self-sufficient, rather rogue buffer state. Amurru eventually attacked the port city of Tunip, whose ruler was being held hostage in Egypt by Akhenaten. That's rather interesting. In fact, Akhenaten ignores letters for help from Tunip, so he seems, in fact, to be cognizant of the imminent fall of Tunip, and, in fact, to some extent, by keeping the ruler in Egypt and not listening to the pleas for help from Tunip against the Amorites, Akhenaten, the Egyptians, appear to have engineered almost the fall of Tunip to the Amorites. Just as Abdi Ashirta fell into his own trap, Akhenaten toyed with Azuru. At one point, an Egyptian official in the north, a man named Hatip, appears to have gotten together forces of a local principality called Nuhase to attack into Amurru. Akhenaten, at the same time, writes to Aziru and asks him why he hasn't dealt with rebuilding Sumur, that was damaged by Aziru himself, of course, when he moved in to, quote, restore order. Aziru reports that Nuhase's attacks had delayed him because he's being attacked by Nuhase on the one side, and Akhenaten's asking him to repair Sumur on the other side. Now, rather than being this player of political intrigue that he clearly believed himself to be, you can look at this to see that Aziru may have been a little bit more of a third wheel who wasn't entirely sure what Akhenaten and Hatip were doing. There's no reason to believe that Hatip launched this reconnaissance in depth out of Nuhase into the Amorite territory without telling Akhenaten what he's doing. And it may very well be that Akhenaten chose exactly the time when Aziru was off trying to stop these incursions from Nuhase to tell him to get back over to Sumur and rebuild Sumur. Like his father before him, Aziru eventually turned his attentions on Byblos. And this time, the Amorites absorb the old coastal city of Byblos. Ribadi, the inveterate correspondent of the Amarna letters, is exiled, and the Amorites finally occupy Byblos. Apparently, under Aziru, the puppet of Akhenaten's efficient passive-aggressive strategy, the pharaoh finally deemed the Amorite state ready to engulf Byblos. The reign of Akhenaten coincided with a series of major changes in Egypt's relationships with Western Asia. Mitanni began to crumble from pressure by the Hittites in Anatolia to the north and Assyria to the east. What Akhenaten does and does not do in the face of these political changes has been much misunderstood, contributing in a number of modern works to a decided view of Akhenaten as a pacifist, when in fact, as relatively inactive as he was militarily, he certainly appears to have surpassed his predecessors in the cold-blooded realpolitik of his reign. What Akhenaten does not do on the diplomatic front simply continues the economy of force that typifies Egyptian military activity. Mitanni sent mixed signals to the Egyptians as it went into its death throes as to what it was or was not prepared to do. The Egyptians certainly, with the rise of the Hittites to the north, seem not to have been interested in the slightest in propping up their old allies, Mitanni. The Hittites were very quickly surpassing Mitanni both in the stability of their kingdom and in the military power at their command. They would no doubt very soon present a much more formidable enemy than the Egyptians had encountered since the Second Intermediate Period. The genius of the Asiatic policy of Amenhotep III and his successor Akhenaten is that both allowed various groups in Syria-Palestine to fight against another, thereby allowing the Hittites to destroy a weak and potentially duplicitous power, Mitanni, thereby allowing an equally duplicitous but less powerful buffer state, Amurru, to form in a place geographically better suited than Mitanni to separate Egyptian holdings from the Hittite sphere of influence. At the same time, Akhenaten quite pointedly refused to accept the vassalage of Amurru. Egypt refused to bring Amurru more closely into the Egyptian sphere. She wanted and engineered the rise of a self-sufficient buffer state. Unfortunately, Kadesh, on the southeastern edge of Amurru, became a point of contention. Kadesh overlooks a corridor through the desert to the east of Amurru that could allow direct access from northern Syria through Transjordan to the very edge of direct Egyptian control, the eastern edge of the Sinai. Akhenaten and his successor Tutankhamun, both near the ends of their reigns, actually launched military campaigns against the city of Kadesh, and both fought inconclusive battles there, each just before his death. It was left to the Ramessid rulers of the next dynasty, the 19th dynasty, to attend once and for all to what we might call the Kadesh Corridor. For Egypt's Asiatic foreign policy, the demise of Mitanni and the rise of Amurru allowed the replacement of one buffer state by another. The shift from Mitanni to Amurru had a significant drawback, however, for Egyptian foreign policy. Since Amurru never really extended further to the east beyond Kadesh, never extended beyond this Bekaa corridor, this north-south corridor in modern southern Lebanon, this limited expansion of Amurru to the east left this no man's land, open to the southern expansion of Hittite influence east of the Orontes River. Near the center of this corridor is where the city of Kadesh was located. Although Amenhotep III and Akhenaten had succeeded brilliantly in their machinations in the ancient Near East, the geopolitical situation in the northern Levant made Kadesh the flashpoint of conflict between Egypt and the Hittites. The largest and the most celebrated battle at Kadesh would not occur until the reign of Ramses II, but 3 earlier battles were fought around that city under Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Seti I.
This ends Lecture 10.